Every journey begins with a simple act of care. For Quest to Unite Africa, that journey started with something simple: a mother, a newborn, and a promise that no life would be forgotten. We did not begin with buildings, we began with people. We packed mother newborn kits with our own hands because real change starts where the need is greatest. Those kids traveled farther than we imagined, and they opened our eyes to a deeper truth. Aid saves lives, but infrastructure saves generations. So we grew. Together with donors, volunteers, and partners, we sent a medical container to Burkina Faso. Not just supplies, but hope. Not just boxes, but proof that when a community comes together, healing moves across borders. That moment changed us because we realized something powerful. We weren't just delivering help, we were building a future. Now the journey continues. The next chapter is bigger than a shipment, bigger than a campaign. We are raising funds to build a state-of-the-art hospital, a place where mothers can give birth safely, where families can find care close to home, and where communities can grow stronger for generations to come. This hospital is not just a structure, it's a promise. A promise that healthcare will no longer be temporary. A promise that dignity will have a permanent home. And just like every step before, we cannot do this alone. Every gift, every brick, every name placed on the founder path becomes part of a story that began with compassion and is growing into legacy. It helps us move from emergency aid to lasting healing, from containers to care that never leaves, from vision to reality. Join us, stand with us, help us build a hospital that will serve generations, moving healthcare into action. Visit Q2UA.org today.
All right. Greetings, salama, everyone. Welcome to Q2UA Discussions Live. And today we're focusing on why Africa is winning. Why Africa is winning. Now I need to do some edits. Well, as you all may know by now, as a majority of us know by now, earlier this week, the UN had voted to recognize enslavement of Africans as greatest crime against humanity. And I'm going to put that, let me put this here in the chat so you see the link that I am looking at. You know, when I say that Africa is winning, the wins aren't necessarily momentous at first. What we're looking at is momentum. And this is a momentum builder that further describes the state of not just Africa, but its standing within the world. Because again, not just Africa, but also African Americans, African diasporans, we had stated that in order for our denigration to continue, which has happened over the last 400 plus years, the ability the ability to control your image is crucial. And there were three nations that said no, because obviously those nations understood the power of image control. And when you have a positive control of your image, I don't care where you are at as a descendant of Africa, you're always going to be looked at in a negative context, no matter how much you try to deny or placate to where you are sitting at in the West, because it was always about being able to make sure that you are negatively reduced. And what this vote here by the UN did, it actually showed the rest of the world what they think about Africa, and not in a negative manner, which also describes and it also shows that the rest of the world is not adhering to the old psychological brainwashing, or let's just be honest, bullying that we have been subjected to over these last 400 plus years. So the tide is turning and Africa is winning. This is from the BBC for 2 days ago. Wadele Chibalushi and Thomas Naadi. The United States General Assembly has voted to recognize the enslavement of Africans during the transatlantic slave trade as the gravest crime against humanity. A move advocates hope will pave the way for healing and justice. The resolution proposed by Ghana called for the designation while also urging UN member states to consider apologizing for the slave trade and contribution to a reparations fund. It does not mention a specific amount of money. The proposal was adopted with 123 votes in favor and 3 against, which is United States, Israel, and Argentina. 52 countries abstained, including the United Kingdom and European Union member states. Countries like the UK have long rejected calls to pay reparations, saying today's institutions cannot be held for past wrongs. Yes, it can, because today's institutions are just another transformation of institutions that had profited, had transferred. Okay, I don't care the amalgamation. The reality is, even though you had received stolen property, it's still stolen property. I don't care how you corporatize the theft. I don't care how you translate that into law or have the legal mechanisms within your jurisdiction, which you are able to do that. That is your right to do that. However, the problem is that when you look at not adhering to universal principles when it comes to civil human justice, those chickens, when they come home to roost, they come home to roost because the same manner in which that nation that had done injustice, when they face injustice or what they deem to be injustice, then they will cry on out for others to help them in some sort of injustice that they feel. If you didn't know, that's what's happening today at this very time, in this very hour, in this very moment. And the world is seeing through that. No matter how much they are threatened, no matter how much they are told to help on out, to provide, to do for the activities going on, especially in the Middle East, the cry of unity to help combat an adversary, an adversarial actor that they claim that was literally negotiating in good faith before they were assaulted. Gee, I don't know if they're going to get any empathy from the continent, because that's usually how things had happened. I don't know, around 4, 5, 600 years ago. So when they try to say a historical crime, well, let me tell you this: if it's never resolved, you're just going to see the same exact things that their forefathers carried on. And again, their forefathers continued, or the actions of their forefathers continue to do the same things that we're witnessing today. So, how do you change a behavior? Because at the end of the day, if the behavior doesn't change, then the consequences of that behavior will be absolutely felt. And it can lead to the cataclysmic destruction, apocalyptic destruction of those people or groups of people that have been partaking in a universal injustice. Crimes against humanity. Well, if you do the crime, just because you haven't done the time just yet doesn't mean that you're going to get away from it. And guess what? It always catches up. But so goes the aspects of certain things, which can be defined and found in the Bible with biblical understanding. Now you understand there is a universal law: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And this has led the European nations that have objected against this UN resolution that had passed, because something odd is happening in their world, in their neck of the woods. Now, when it comes to the continent, something interesting is occurring. And I want to come in here. This is from Business Insider Africa. Iran's Hormuz disruption turns little used Kenyan port into refuge for shipping traffic. This is from Adekunle Agbe Ag, Agbeteloye. I probably definitely butchered it, but this was as of March 20th, last week. Since the outbreak of the Iran Israel conflict in late February, disruptions along the Strait of Hormuz have rattled global trade, hitting many African economies hard. But amid the disruption, Kenya's Lamu port has emerged as an unlikely beneficiary. I can guarantee you that this port probably has a lot more traffic than what you're seeing right now. And I would probably argue that this may be some stock photo because, there's images and imagery that is deemed acceptable. Don't get it twisted. This is still, you know, Business Insider. It's just Africa. Excuse me. The sudden constraints on movement through the strait have forced vessels bound for the Middle East to reroute, with some now diverting and offloading cargo at the underutilized port along Kenyan's northern coast. Before the recent escalation, Lamu struggled to attract consistent traffic. Neighboring Ethiopia, the continent's second most populous nation, relies heavily on Djibouti's port, while most shipping lines prefer Mombasa due to its established road and rail links to Uganda and the wider region. And let me just kind of explain some things to you. Djibouti's port is owned and authorized, or excuse me, owned and operated by China. That is one of the many Chinese ports that are basically effectively Chinese ran. And so you have to understand that when you are using those ports, you're really not having a lot of port fees or the total amount of port fees. You have a residual, but not a lot. And those port fees, a majority of it goes to nations outside of Africa. So therefore, you're really seeing a very unique opportunity for the continent, particularly an African nation, being able to really collect a majority of its port fees. And that becomes very, very instrumental. Now, it was purported, and I want to be very careful. I am on Q2UA. It was purported that the gifts that um, the United States President Donald Trump had talked about, those gifts were ships exiting the Strait of Hormuz that had been stuck in the waters of the Persian Gulf. However, big caveat, they weren't necessarily gifts. These were ships that were able to transit the Strait of Hormuz after they had been authorized by the Iranian government to leave the strait. And they were going to places like Pakistan and India. Because again, India is very fair weather. They're very flaky. They're very, very flaky. And so, again, one of the conditions, actually, a couple of the conditions that Iran has is that when the ships exit, they are not the cargo. Anything that they have is not to be used to support Western interests that is fighting against them, i.e., Israel and the United States and the UK. and potentially other nations of the African Union. So, right now, these are the ongoing negotiations. So, there was no present because nothing was directly impacting the United States. However, from a global impact, what that does was it indirectly supported the United States because obviously there was oil in the markets, even though Iran was making money. Because now ships leaving the Strait of Hormuz will now be under toll of about $2 million per ship. So, if you look at the model in a more soft approach, the residual outcome and benefits, especially when you have port and dock fees, a lot of ships are going to have to reroute to open waters, particularly off of the African coast, because what they preferred to do was to keep their money and their resources out of Africa. Those days are now over effectively, which means that there's opportunities for more than likely a lot of port and port operations. A couple of years ago, when I was in Tanzania, they had asked when I visited the Tanzanian parliament, they were asking about helping to improve port infrastructure in a place called Matawa. Matawa. And Matawa it was a southern port in Tanzania. Now their major port is obviously Dar es Salaam, but they understood how things are starting to really ramp up in the global atmosphere, even way before this is a couple years before this war that is happening right now in the Middle East. So that just shows the foresight of our people. The problem is that just like everything else you have in Dar es Salaam, you have a lot of port fees going to other countries rather than a lot or a vast amount or a greater amount of port fees, percentage wise, staying in the hands of the Tanzanian government. And this is something that Africa now has a chance to renegotiate. Hey, Qatar, Kuwait, and Iraq had to call some force majeure contracts. Well, Africa, listen up and pay attention because sometimes you will receive residual gifts based off of indirect opportunities from major global events. So I pray that our brothers and sisters on the continent hear this message and apply this message appropriately because once they realize that the shift in power is occurring right now globally as we're speaking, that the opportunity to chart its own destiny is an opportunity that we pray is not wasted because it just doesn't affect them. It also affects us here within the African diaspora, wherever you are at. So, with that, thank you for tuning in to Q2A Discussions Live because we see that Africa is winning and all they do is win. And looks to me that they're winning hugely and bigly. They're the best winners ever. So if you'd like to support Q2UA in its endeavors, especially the Hospital Project Initiative, in order for a nation, in order for a people, in order for a continent to survive, well, guess what? You need to have medical. A strong, healthy people is a strong, healthy economy. Please support our efforts here as we're winding down our campaign to provide and support the the acquisition for our first phase 1 of our hospital. You could do so by visiting Q2UA.org, and you'll see that hospital initiative, hospital project initiative right there in the top banner. So, with that, thank you for your support. Thank you for your prayers. And you all have a blessed and awesome day. Hallelujah.